We might want to add custom logic to our Platformatic application that's run whenever an entity in our database is retrieved or modified. In this video, we'll learn how we can do this with a feature called Entity Hooks. Here we have a basic Platformatic DB app. We've got Platformatic installed as a dependency. We have Platformatic DB config file. And here we have an as yet mostly empty plugin. And we're going to be building some functionality in here. We have the server actually already up and running, listening to requests. So in our plugin here, we're going to actually add in some code using entity hooks. And these allow us to actually go and change what's happening when data is retrieved, for example. So in this case, we're going to access the entity hooks method, which is there on our Platformatic object. And we're going to set an object. So we're going to be saying that for the quote entity, when the find operation is run, we're going to run this hook. And so this hook is going to be this async function, and it accepts the original find method. And that's the built-in find method, which the Platformatic SQL mapper has. And we're going to then use that here. We're going to actually await and call the original find. And we're just passing those options straight through. So what we actually want to do is then change the results that come through. So we're going to iterate through them with map. And then we're going to actually, for each row, we're going to change the quote value. So we'll do this just to make sure it's safe. And then we're going to uppercase each quote on its way out. And then because we're in a map, we need to make sure we return that row. So the code that we've written here will actually execute any time a quote is retrieved from our API, whether that's through the REST API or the GraphQL API. Now let's call the API endpoint to retrieve those quotes. So we're going to get the quotes back from our API, and we'll just give it a little bit of formatting with JQ. And we can see here now that every quote has been uppercased. And we can see that's happened for every quote that's coming back from our API. So this entity hook has been run when we've tried to actually retrieve those quotes from the database, and our find hooks has been applied, and every row has had its quote uppercased. We can also add a hook for when we save. In this case, we're going to accept the original save method, and we'll accept all the options that get passed through. And then inside that entity hook function, we're going to take the input that's been passed through, that quote property, and we're going to just change it around a bit. So in this case, we're going to actually split it up into all the separate characters, then we're going to reverse them all, and then we're going to join them back together again. So effectively, we're reversing the quote itself that's come through. And then we can return await, and we're going to call that original save method and pass through the options. So this is a case of actually taking through the input that's come through and changing one property. And if we head back, we'll see that our server's been restarted with the plugin changes. We can head over into our browser. And now if we go and actually make a post to the quotes route, let's have a look at trying it out. We'll remove ID because that's automatically added for us by the API and created at. And so we're going to say that this is a fantastic quote said by someone, and we'll add it to whatever our first movie is. And now if we execute that, we'll see then in the response body that our quote has been reversed by that entity hook that we added for when quotes are saved. Another good use case for entity hooks are controlling what things can be deleted, so we can add some extra conditions. And in this case, we're going to take that original delete method that comes through, and inside of our entity hook function, we're going to actually retrieve the record that's being deleted. So we can do some extra checks on it. So we're going to use that quote entity, and inside of that, we're going to retrieve the said by field so we can see who said the quote. And then we're going to pass through the where clause, and that's coming through in those options. So this is the where clause for deleting a quote. So it'll have the actual quote ID inside of it. So we're using that in this case to actually find the quote before we handle any kind of deletion. Now what we're going to do is actually check. So it'll be the first row that comes back, and then we'll check if it was said by, And we'll check if it's said by a specific person. So if it was said by this person, then we're going to throw a new error. And we'll say cannot delete quotes by, and we will then that error will be thrown out, and if actually everything's fine, the code will continue executing, and so it can just go ahead with deleting. So let's test this out by going and making a request to our API, and we're going to delete quote. So this is quote number 4, which has this particular person who said it. So we're going to then pass quotes 4, and we'll be using the HTTP method delete. So let's pass that through to curl. And you'll see that we get this error message back, cannot delete quotes, which is great. Now let's just check we haven't completely broken the delete functionality. So let's try and go and delete another one. We'll delete quote number 3. And when we delete quote number 3, we can see that everything's working fine, and we've been able to delete that quote. We can define entity hooks for any kind of operation against an entity. It gives us full flexibility, for example, to add custom authorization checks or generate dynamic fields on the fly as we're inserting them into the database.